Good morning, everybody joining us in Asia. Good evening to our guests in America and elsewhere. My name is Andy Staples, and I'm the Director of Research and Outreach for the Hinrich Foundation here in Singapore. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar today. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this, including our distinguished guests and our lineup of experts of discussionists. We're here to discuss one of the key geopolitical issues of the day, namely the nature and direction of the relationship between the world's two biggest economies, the US and China. Given the time restraints, I'll be very brief with our introductions. Please, apologies for that. The full bios of our guests are on the website. But I'm particularly honored to welcome Clyde Prestowitz, who is the founder and president of the Economic Strategy Institute and has worked on Asia and globalization for 50 years, writing many best-selling books in the process, and many of those I've read during my studies and work over the years as well. He was a leader of the first US trade mission to China in 1982 and is a veteran US trade negotiator and presidential advisor. His latest book, The World Turned Upside Down, America, China, and the Struggle for Global Leadership, is the subject of our discussion today. Our second guest is Ted Alden, who's the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in US economic competitiveness, trade, and immigration policy. A former Washington bureau chief of the Financial Times and managing editor of the newsletter Inside US Trade, which is widely recognized as a leading source of reporting on US trade policies. Ted is the author of the book, Failure to Adjust, How Americans got left behind in the global economy. And finally, we're also joined by Dr. Elizabeth Economy, a senior fellow at the Stanford University's Hoover Institute. She is an acclaimed author, an expert on China, China's domestic and foreign policy, and indeed, Dr. Economy was named as one of the top 10 names that matter on China policy by Politico magazine. And her most recent book is titled The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State. Thank you all very much for joining us. Just before we get underway and get the discussion started, I would like to draw your attention to all of our guests to the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Please do send in questions at any point. Please try to be succinct and short, and keep your questions to just one question per person, so that I can try and get through as many as possible. And I should also note that this session is being recorded, and a recording of this discussion will be available on our website next week. So, with all the preliminaries out of the way, I'd like to really jump straight in. And Clyde, thank you again so much for joining us. And your new book, I think, draws on your experiences and reflections in Asia over the past 50 years. But I'm going to ask you to summarize your thesis and intention of your book in just 15 minutes. This will allow us then to get a flavor of your ideas and thoughts, and then we can get into the discussion with Elizabeth and Ted as well. So perhaps you could start by sharing with us your the genesis and motivation for your book.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and also Elizabeth and Ted. So it was the end of 2017. I thought I was watching a bad movie that I felt I had seen a lot of it before. The bad movie was that the U.S. is losing badly in economic, strategic competition, technological competition, with an opponent that is diametrically opposed to free world democratic values. And I felt that we were getting into a really dangerous situation. I thought I had seen the movie before because it's actually not a new situation. We've been here before, going all the way back to the 1950s, when you may remember that Japan was beginning to eat up various US industries. So in the 1950s, Japan took over the textile industry, and then in the 60s, the consumer electronics industry, and in the 70s that began to invade the US auto and semiconductor industries. I graduated from college in 1963. I went out to the East-West Center in Honolulu to study Japanese. Coincidentally, while I was there, I met a smart, cute Chinese lady. We got married. And then I took her to Japan, where I completed my study at Keio University. And at the time, the Japanese miracle was being proclaimed. In 1964, the Economist magazine cover story was the Japanese miracle. But honestly, it didn't look like a miracle. To young kids coming from America at the time, Japan still looked pretty poor. I was back in Japan in the 1970s, first as a consultant for a Swiss consulting firm, and then as the CEO of the Japanese subsidiary of an American company that made artificial kidneys. And so in the 1970s, Japan had arrived. It was, people weren't riding bikes anymore, they were driving cars, and it was a fully accomplished miracle. And I learned a lot about how Japan operates in business, how it really looks inside as well as outside. And then in 1981, I was named counselor to the Secretary of Commerce in the Mac Baldrige in the Reagan administration. And he told me that my job was to fix the trade deficit with Japan. And I had taken a year leave of absence from my job with American Can Company. And so I said, sure, I'm sure I can do this in a year, and then I'll go back to American Can Company. At the time, the US trade deficit with Japan was about $15 billion annually. Also, I was supposed to look after trade missions to China and a bit of negotiation with South Korea, but Japan was the main target. Now, at that point, Japan was agreeing to voluntary export restraints. It voluntarily, quote unquote, limited its exports of autos to the US market. And today you think of Intel as a giant multinational corporation, but in 1984, Intel came that close to bankruptcy. Why? Because Japanese semiconductor companies were eating their lunch. And so I got deeply into the US-Japan trade battle, and there was a pattern to the battle. The pattern was that some American company would come to the Commerce Department and complain that Japan was cheating. They couldn't get into the Japanese market. There were these invisible trade barriers, and the Japanese were just cheating. And so we in the US would go to the Japanese and we say, hey guys, come on, we're allies and we like you, but you're cheating, stop it. And the Japanese would say, what are you talking about? Look, the problem is your businessmen don't try hard enough. Their quality, American quality stinks. The delivery is always late. Look at the cars. You put the steering wheel on the wrong side. I mean, come on, how can you expect to sell anything here? And it didn't matter. It could be autos, semiconductors, peanuts. It didn't matter. That was the format of the debate. And after a while, I began to think about why are we in this back and forth? And it hit me that there were two key assumptions underlying that debate. One was that Japan was a democracy like America. And secondly, that it was a market capitalist economy like the US. And so if that were the case, then if there's a problem, only two explanations are possible. One, somebody's not doing their job, or two, somebody's cheating. But I thought about, wait a minute, I've been in Japan now for a long time. Is Japan a democracy like the US? Well, not really. It's only had, at that point, it had only had one party governing the country since the war. But more importantly, the Japanese bureaucracy was immensely more powerful than the American bureaucracy. A Japanese vice minister could call up the head of any major Japanese corporation and effectively over the phone tell them what to do. And he would do it. And he wasn't thinking he could go to court and take the Japanese government to court. He knew he would lose. Well, American vice undersecretaries or assistant secretaries can't do that. And the second point was Japan had a strategy. They called it catch up. And one of the authors, one of the architects of that was a guy named Amaya Naohiro. And I became friendly with him, and he explained to me, he said, Clyde, look, he said, after the war, the Americans came to us and told us how to run our economy. And they said, you have a lot of cheap labor. You should make labor intensive products like toys and textiles and things like that. And he said, we decided to do the opposite of what the Americans told us. We decided to catch up. We wanted to have a steel industry and an auto industry and a machine tool industry and a semiconductor industry and a computer industry just like you. And he said, look, it's a matter of national security. And so what Japan was doing was pursuing what became known as industrial policy. It subsidized certain technologies and industries. It protected them. It didn't allow foreign investment very much in Japan. If you did invest in Japan, you had to transfer technology to a partner in Japan. At one time, the Boston Consulting Group calculated that Japan had forced the transfer of something like $500 million of American technology, which at the time sounded like a big number. But in any case, the bottom line was Japan was playing a different game. It was like nobody, the Japanese weren't cheating and we were trying hard, but we were playing baseball and the Japanese were playing American football. And all the debate was nonsense because we weren't working off of the same background, the same pattern. So I went through the 1980s with that. And of course, eventually the Japanese economy had a big bubble and the bubble burst and Japan has become an aging society. And so the Japan stories kind of moved off the front page. But I was named as vice chairman of President Clinton's Commission on Trade and Investment in Asia in the mid-1990s. And of course, I had been watching China since '82. And particularly running around Asia in the mid-1990s, I had kind of a different feeling about what was happening than I think most of the rest of the observers. To me, it looked like China was kind of repeating Japan. And I was skeptical that China was going to evolve as a market free trade kind of economy. But what I noticed was that whereas in the case of Japan, we had assumed that Japan was a democracy and we know what a democracy was. In the case of China, after the end of the Cold War, there was a broad spread sense, books were written about this, the end of history, broad sense that the future was going to be democracy. And, one, it was going to be democracy because that was what worked. And second, there was a sense that free trade and globalization was linked to democratization. And that, I worked with a number of the key players in play at that time, a number of top executives and president and others. And I know from my own personal experience, they thought that investing in China and trading with China, maybe it wouldn't make China democracy, but it would make it more liberal and more like us. And then in 2005, I wrote a book called 3 Billion New Capitalists, in which I spent a year running around looking at the Chinese industrial base. And it was also at a point when the Chinese were beginning in their 5-year plans to talk seriously about future technological development. And I realized, look, this is Japan all over again, except that in the case of Japan, the US provided Japan's defense. The US had enormous leverage on Japan, and whereas in the case of China, we had none. And whereas Japan was a friendly country, China was fundamentally based on principles antithetical to our own. And then, as Elizabeth has so well documented, Xi Jinping comes along, and he, rather than becoming more liberal, he goes in the direction of more centered on being more communist and more authoritarian. And we have Made in China 2025. And made in China 2025, to me, sounded just like ketchup in Japan. And it is. And I think that what now I think is becoming more a matter of discussion is that we're not going to change China. So much of our debate with China up until now, we've had these high-level meetings. Hank Paulson had high-level meetings with Zhu Rongji and all the top Chinese. And I've been in those meetings myself, and they're all polite, and we have good Chinese food, and people keep talking past each other. But the idea always was, Bob Zoellick used to talk about, we want China to be a responsible stakeholder in the liberal, global, rules-based order. And in our own discussions among ourselves, we would talk about how we needed to get China to persuade China to change and to comply more with the WTO rules and to get rid of this industrial policy and forced technology transfer, et cetera. I just came to the same conclusion I came to with Japan. They're not going to do it. They're winning. It's working for China. The WTO rules are vague enough and broad enough that you can run a freight train through them without technically breaking the rules. And our own industry, and this is very important, our own companies, we call them American companies, but in a very important way, they're not. They invest in China on sufferance. They in Washington are powerful. They have armies of lawyers and lobbyists. They spend millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on influencing US government policy and legislation. They have instant entree at the White House, in the Congress, at the think tanks. In Beijing, they're on their knees and they're hostage. And we don't understand that typically. Our policymakers are not fully absorbing that. And so, I think I have some ideas about how to deal with it. And essentially, it's in a way, it's to return to our past. What we have based our diplomatic and our international policy since 1950, since the end of World War II, on free trade. And of course, we had NATO and the Cold War, but throughout the whole period, last 71 years, we have been basing ourselves on a concept of international trade, free trade, globalization, and security alliances. And however, from 1815 until 1948, the United States had an industrial policy. We were like China. We were like Japan. We protected industries. We subsidized industries. Abe Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, raises tariffs on steel higher than anybody had ever imagined. And he was criticized for that because people said it would raise the price of steel. And Abe said, no, it won't. We're going to have such economies of scale that we'll be the low-cost producer. And Lincoln turned out to be right. By the early 1900s, we had the world's biggest steel industry. RCA, Radio Corporation of America, in the 1960s, 70s, it was the king of television. It was founded by Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt during the Versailles Conference at the end of World War I. So we know how to do industrial policy, and my thought is we need to go back to that, a lot of that. And then secondly, we need to get our own macroeconomic house in order. For the moment, we need, I believe we need a big stimulus package, as Biden is proposing. But over the longer haul, we need to save more, consume less. We need to even out the distribution of our income. And we need to put a lot more into education, infrastructure, and job training, and a lot less into consumption and into wasteful wars and so forth. So I think it's not something we can't do. It's something that requires a change of mindset and commitment and a pulling together of the United States and pulling allies together. But I warn on the ally point. I'm all for allies as Biden is proposing, but we can't be limited by how far our allies are willing to go. We need not to adopt the lowest common denominator. We need to look out for what we think we need to have. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, Clyde, thank you very much for taking us through the genesis of the book, and your focus there on what the US needs to do makes up, I think, some of the key recommendations in the latter part of your text. But you also have a whole set of recommendations about how the US should be then engaging with or dealing with China, which you describe as the key challenge for the United States. I wonder if you could just very succinctly outline what those policy responses to China or how that relationship with China should be based, reset.
I think, it's kind of like Michael Corleone in The Godfather. It's not personal. It's just business. And yeah, we're going to put tariffs on you, but hey, we like you. You have restrictions on some of what we can do in your economy. We're going to restrict what you can do in our economy. But, it's business and it's not personal. I think that China does what it thinks it has to do. We should do what we think we have to do. I wouldn't waste a lot of time talking to the Chinese. There are certain things, of course, we have to talk about, but there's no payoff there. The payoff is talking to ourselves and our allies and getting our game together.
Thank you, Clyde, very much. And perhaps at this point, I could bring in Dr. Economy. Liz, thank you again for joining us today. And it's going to be very good to get your perspective on this issue and the background that Clyde has just provided over those decades, thinking about how the relationship with China has evolved. That actually China's been quite straightforward in what it wants to do. It wants to grow its economy. It wants to become a moderately prosperous society, and so on. And this is how we're going to do it through accessing the global market, WTO accession 20 years ago, the 20th anniversary this year, of course. And a lot of the policy suggestions that Clyde was just outlining there, domestically in the US, makes a lot of sense. But in terms of that relationship with the United States, how do you think Beijing views this type of more realist understanding of what China is and what it wants to do?
Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here with you and Clyde and Ted to talk about Clyde's terrific new book. This is I think a really challenging time in the U.S.-China relationship, perhaps one of the lowest points since normalization of relations in 1979. And I think for the U.S., it's really trying to figure out the best path forward. And I actually think that Clyde's book offers some really important new ideas. In terms of how the Chinese are likely to react to the recommendations in Clyde's book, as I mentioned to you before, I think the first word that comes to my mind is just badly. I was kind of laughing as I was reading through the book, and I had that in the back of my mind. I don't see much in Clyde's book that the Chinese are going to be very excited about, because his argument, as you've just heard, is that in many respects, the U.S.'s policy of engagement was naive, or at least gave too great an advantage to China, and it's time for a pretty significant course correction. If I were in Beijing, I think I would see three broad challenges to my interests. And Clyde has an entire chapter that's about the plan for China, and so I'm going to just bounce my thoughts off of that. I think, first is Clyde's recommendation for reciprocity, which he just alluded to there toward the end. And I can tell you that the idea that the United States, would not give Chinese companies, diplomats, or journalists, benefits that the US doesn't receive in China is shocking to many Chinese. They have a very difficult time grasping the idea, and they're often outraged that the United States would reduce the number of their journalists or recommend that there aren't any Confucius Institutes on university campuses, or that Chinese technology companies should somehow be constrained in the United States. As Americans, I could say that there's a huge irony in this, right? But the Chinese don't seem to appreciate that. And I think it's because they genuinely believe that the US system is one way, and they're simply taking advantage of it. And their system is another way. And so from their perspective, the United States is, not only changing the rules midstream, but it's also treating Chinese companies or journalists differently from the way that the US would treat European or other Asian companies and journalists. So reciprocity, which plays a pretty big role in Clyde's book, definitely unnerves the Chinese. I would say so far, it hasn't actually made them change their behavior. I think, the Trump administration was really the first to sort of try out reciprocity, but it still may. So I think we're still at the very early stages of this. I think a second recommendation of Clyde's that the Chinese would find challenging is the idea of decoupling. And Clyde talks about decoupling both in terms of the economy and also in political terms. And on the economic front, again, here, I think the Trump administration certainly has begun this process. And China's responded in two ways. On the one hand, Xi Jinping has made an effort in a few targeted areas to open up, to continue to try to attract foreign investment, for example, in autos. But at the same time, Xi's response is, okay, if you're going to pursue decoupling, we're going to become even more self-reliant. And the truth is that, yes, China had Made in China 2025, which Clyde just mentioned, and that really is all about decoupling, right? Made in China 2025 basically said that, China wanted Chinese companies, right, to dominate in the Chinese market, right, to have 70, 80, 90% of the manufacturing of components for 10 areas of critical cutting edge technology, medical devices, new materials. I mean, basically everything that the United States is good at. And China was saying, we are now going to put all of this in our own hands. So that was back in 2014, 2015. Trump administration comes in, starts to respond in kind to some extent. And now Xi Jinping has pushed forward with dual circulation, which is, this internal loop that he's developed, which is that China can, innovate, manufacture, and consume, because they've got, between 1.3 and 1.4 billion people. And yes, they'll engage with the international community, in terms of exports, of course, but also for sort of targeted technology and know-how and some capital. So, but they're going to very much control what comes in. So, and they're talking now actually about agricultural self-sufficiency in a way that I haven't heard in decades in China. So that is actually something new. So I think that the challenge for decoupling for them is not that they weren't already proceeding down that path to some extent, but that we've accelerated the process for them in ways that they weren't prepared for. And I think we see this with semiconductors and Huawei and some Chinese companies that are really suffering. Maybe I'll skip on the political side. We can come back to that later because I want to leave more time for more discussion and just go to the third set of issues that Clyde raises. And I think that's around values. And I think he sort of, touched on that there when he was talking about the difference between Japan as a democracy and as an ally, and then China, which is neither. And I think one of the concerns that I certainly hear in the dialogues that I participated with Chinese scholars and analysts is a lot of concern that the Biden administration might layer on a values competition, right, onto what they see as primarily an economic and technological competition between the United States and China. And even though China has emerged, from the pandemic economically the strongest of any of the major economies, the idea of an alliance of democracies that would include 9 of the 10 largest economies in the world, the 10th being China, of course, is certainly not appealing to China. They're already navigating this values-based competition around technology. But now you've got European countries, Germany, the UK, France, and the Netherlands, sailing through the South China Sea in support of freedom of navigation. You have large groups of countries standing up in the United Nations to criticize China on Xinjiang or on Hong Kong. China's reputation globally is quite poor. Countries in Europe and Asia in particular rank Xi Jinping very low on trust. So the idea that you're going to get a group of countries together that might more consistently act together based on political values, I think is very troubling to Beijing. So I think, as I suggested at the outset, there's not much in this book that sort of extends a hand to China. But I think, again, in the United States, we're at a moment where the kind of realistic thinking that Clyde is presenting in this book I think is what is going to take hold with the Biden administration.
Liz, thank you. It's interesting, you know, that sort of values competition there, and what was missing, what's different between the relationship between the US and Japan and the US and China is, of course, that leverage, as Clyde mentioned, the security alliance and so on. And it seems that this that values and actually getting like-minded countries together could be that type of leverage that the States has. Maybe we can come back to think about that a little bit later on when we come to turn our thoughts to the current Biden administration and its approach to the US, to China. Sorry. On that though, Ted, I'd like to come to you, and your area of focus is of course on the US economy, its competitiveness and so on. So a lot of what Clyde was talking about around industrial policy, the need to invest in the United States, training and education, get better on innovation and channeling savings into investment and R&D and so on. That would resonate strongly with you, I would suspect. But just to remind you, you're on mute, and then if I could get your thoughts on Clyde's text. Okay.
There we go. My computer was fighting me a little bit. Thanks very much. It's great to be here with Clyde and with Liz, and thanks to the Hinrich Foundation. Clyde was too modest to hold up his book, but it's a tremendous book. He has a wonderful network of contacts throughout the United States and Asia. He's a wonderful writer. I certainly learned a lot when I was young by his work on Japan. Influenced a lot of my thinking about trade back in the early 90s. So I really wanted to kind of make 4 points in response to his recommendations for the United States. I mean, the first, in terms of domestic revitalization, I think the book generally gets this right. I mean, there are many of us, Clyde before me, but I've been doing it for a bunch of years as well, and a lot of other people talking about the need for the United States to invest far more in infrastructure, to reinvest heavily in research and development, to take steps to revitalize manufacturing, to not just imagine that the free market is going to sort all of this out in a way that benefits the United States. I think the new Biden administration is very much on board with that whole set of recommendations. I mean, their foreign policy for the middle class, the whole Biden Build Back Better plan is very much written along these lines. I think the interesting difference from where we were, say, during the Obama administration is I also think there's the potential for some bipartisan consensus on this. I think the concern about competition from China that Clyde writes about so well has galvanized support from the Republican side. I mean, the Trump administration really changed the approach to China in some fundamental ways, and there are Republicans like Marco Rubio and others who I think would be supportive of what really looks like an industrial policy kind of response, which we last saw in response to the Japan challenges that Clyde talked about. I think the challenges here are bigger and deeper, but I think there is an environment in Washington now for industrial policy of various sorts. A second point that I think is kind of obvious, but Clyde does a devastating critique of the decades in which the United States hoped that opening up to trade with China would change China's behavior in some fundamental way. I don't think anybody in Washington believes that anymore. I don't think they believe that U.S. actions are going to influence terribly what the Chinese do or don't do. And I think that's a new kind of realism that is definitely welcome. There are 2 points I really have some concern with Clyde's recommendations, and I think there'll be struggles over this within the Biden administration. One is, I think, even though he does mention alliances, I think he minimizes the importance of the partners that the United States has around the world. Liz talked about this in terms of values. The embrace, for instance, Clyde says we should go back to 19th century mercantilism, behave the way we did up through the end of the Second World War. Well, part of the reason we behaved differently after the Second World War was we were trying to build larger alliances to deal with the challenge from the Soviet Union. I think that same interest holds now, and I would argue for being a little more accommodating than Clyde suggests in trying to build and strengthen those alliances. I think that was the the fundamental mistake that the Trump administration made over the last 4 years, just talking in trade policy, which is the area I know most about, to be going after our close allies and hitting them with tariffs at the same time we were trying to get their support for a tougher approach to China. The Biden administration has clearly signaled it's going to work far more closely with allies. I think the WTO matters here. I mean, I don't disagree with Clyde. I don't think the WTO is going to be able to constrain China in any fundamental way, but it is tremendously important to the rest of the world. The Europeans care deeply about it. The Australians care deeply about it. The Canadians care deeply about it. The smaller countries care deeply about it. And I think the utter disregard that the Trump administration had for the workings of the WTO really hurt the United States. And I think revitalizing that organization, even accepting that, look, China isn't going to change things because the WTO tells it to change things. But I think it's important for strengthening those partnerships with other countries, which is part of the key to responding to the challenge from China affected in a number of areas, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, I think most importantly, semiconductors, which are of course the oil of the 21st century economy. We are going to see real efforts by the United States to eliminate any dependence on China. Whether that's bringing it all back to the United States or working with other countries remains to be seen. But I think those are kind of clearly hard lines. I think there are a lot of fuzzy areas, and the fuzzy areas are going to be the difficult ones. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks, we should decouple in consumer electronics, right? Television sets. I don't, that's not a strategic goal, but there are gray areas. What about Apple and smartphones? It's kind of a consumer electronics product, but it's also a high-tech product. Should we be pressuring Tim Cook to bring, all Apple production back from China? Clyde suggests in his book that we should. I don't know. Would the increase in cost for consumers for whom these devices are kind of vital these days, would that offset the benefits? Clyde mentioned solar panels, in which the Chinese have cheated terribly. There's no question about that, but it's also meant that the price of solar panels has come down dramatically, and that's a key part of responding effectively to the challenge of global warming, which is an area that the Biden administration says we can cooperate with China. So I think there are a bunch of difficult questions about, okay, some degree of decoupling is going to take place, but how much, in what sectors, and what's the rationale for it? So let me stop there, and I'll throw it back to you, Andrew.
Ted, thanks very much. And I should remind everybody, there are some questions coming in, which I'm reviewing now, and we'll get to. I would encourage everybody to send through short questions if you can. But let me pick up on a couple of things there, and post these back to Clyde. And just to remind you, Clyde, you're on mute. Liz, in her third key area there, was talking about values, competition, talking about alliances. This is something that Ted picked up as well. Be more accommodating with alliances. And I'll just bring in a sort of specific point on that. There was a question there thinking about semiconductors and Taiwan and what role. But on this point of alliances, what should and can the United States be doing now with its more friendly trading partners around the world, in Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I don't want to give the impression I'm against alliances. I lived 7 years in Europe, and I believe in alliances. And I think a mistake the Trump administration made was, as Ted said, in throwing tariffs on Canada and the Europeans, which was kind of needless. I think that I like what Biden is doing so far in trying to revitalize the alliances. I'm very encouraged by the Quad in the Indo-Pacific with Japan, US, South Korea, Australia. And I think that I even in my book, I think the Philippines is a critical area that we have paid almost no attention to. The nice thing about the Philippines is it's a small economy. So a little bit of money is actually a lot in the Philippines. And China is, as you know, making big inroads diplomatically with the Belt and Road. The Philippines needs roads, and for not a lot of money, the Western countries, or the free world countries, could build out the Philippines in a similar way. And I think that's just an example, but it's one that I brought up in the book. I guess my concern about alliances is this. We saw the Europeans just very quickly try to sign an agreement with China on investment just before Biden was inaugurated. And Angela Merkel she's worried about German cars being sold in China. And she wanted to get that deal done before Biden got in. And so that tells me that, okay, I want Germany as an ally, and I'm glad Germany has done a second look at 5G for its telecom. But, can I, as the United States, say, well, okay, Merkel, I understand you need to sell cars in China, so okay, go ahead. And honestly, the deal she signed is, it's embarrassing. Germany's got nothing, in fact. So that's what I mean about I want allies. I'm all for allies, but you always get into the question of the lowest common denominator, and I think we need to make sure that the denominator is reasonably high.
Let me just follow up briefly on the alliances.
If I could just add one more thing. Elizabeth raised the question of values, which is, I think, really, really important. And it also gets to a point that Ted made. Look, I have two really good friends in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai and Martin Lee. They're both going to go to jail. They're both old men. They're going to die probably in some Chinese, I guess, mainland prison. For what? Because they're for free speech and a rule of law. Now, every iPhone that Apple makes in China contributes to the strength of the Chinese economy. And so when you think about decoupling, it's not just, I think, thinking about the nuts and bolts and the economics. I think you have to think about values as well.
Just let me follow up on that point of values and alliances and bring the focus on to Australia. Australia's in the crosshairs at the moment. So we've had the list of 14 grumbles, demands from Beijing. We've got tariffs on everything from wine to barley and so on, not iron ore, of course, crucial to the Chinese economy. But what can the United States, what can and should the United States be doing with that, very firm ally that it has in the Asia region on this particular issue? And Clyde, I wonder if you could get your thoughts on that one.
I have suggested to the administration, and I've written on this, this is a case where allies could really be important. So if we got the EU and Canada, US, Mexico, so the Chinese have stopped buying Aussie wine. I'm a fan of Aussie wine. I'd like more of it. We should get our allies together and buy Aussie wine. Let the Chinese not drink Aussie wine. Let's take their wine. What we need is a buying consortium, and it could be, it could be a major multilateral program. We're going to have a consortium, and when China tries to bully people by cutting off their wine or their barley or whatever it is, okay, we have a mechanism here to smooth out the rough spots, and it'll greatly diminish China's likelihood of continuing to play the bully.
And Liz, to come back to you on that point, this is, I think, as you identified earlier on, one of the key fears that Beijing might have, that there is more of a united front that would stand up on this particular issue around trade coercion. Is that correct?
Right. I think they're probably even past what Clyde suggested, which actually there's this interparliamentary alliance on China that has about 100 different members of Congress and parliamentarians around the world who did do this Buy Australia Wine campaign. Actually, it was hilarious. So they did a big commercial. It was very funny. And I think there was a lot, and I'll tell you, in the China community, there was a big push for people like me to buy Australian wine. So there's a lot going on, but not really going to make a dent. I think what they're even more concerned about, is not simply a buy Australian wine, but a punish China by doing some kind of, reciprocity thing, right? By doing, banning something from China, right? And putting together a consortium that would put some tariffs on something that China was going to export. So there's that kind of discussion going on in the China community, I can tell you, in the United States and elsewhere, about how can allies work together to undertake some kind of punitive measures against China when China tries to do this economic coercion. It's certainly not the first time they've done it. It's Philippines and the bananas. It was, Lotte department stores in South Korea when they took the THAAD missile deployment. There's a lot of, we've seen this movie many times before, and it's time that we we found some kind of united response. And I would just make the point on the European trade deal, investment deal with China. I completely agree that they wanted to get it done before Biden got into office, and then they felt some real pressure to coordinate. Europe, Germany is, I think, represents 40% of all Europe's exports to China. So I think Angela Merkel had a huge incentive to get it done. And what I found to be very interesting right now is a lot of the smaller countries in Europe, the Baltics, some of the Central European countries are beginning to flee the 17+1 China agreement for the Belt and Road, say this hasn't paid off for us in any way. And we may find in the United States and Australia and elsewhere that we're going to have new sources of support for a tougher policy on China, maybe not coming initially from Germany and France, but potentially from some of these smaller countries, from the UK. I think it's going to be an interesting mix, I think, that's going to emerge.
Okay, I'm going to dive into some of the questions here. We've got plenty coming through. Thanks for those. 2 or 3 on the issue of demographics. And Clyde, you sort of raised this issue earlier on with reference to Japan becoming an aging society. And of course, China faces that as well. And we often hear that Japan is getting old, but it got rich first. And it's the opposite that applies to China. Just your thoughts on that demographic structure of the economy. And maybe that links back to Japan as number 1, which never happened, and the sort of the thesis that China is at a similar point today. I wonder if you could draw some comparisons there with reference to demographics.
Well, I think the demographic thing is very important. We have seen it and are seeing it in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China. I saw a projection recently. China today's got like 1.34 billion people, and I saw a projection by the end of the century it would be down to 700 million. Now it's pretty heavily weighted towards the latter 50 years of the century, but still, certainly by 2040, China's population will be declining. The workforce is already declining, and that will bite more and more. But let's also look at Japan. Japan is really suffering aging and now absolutely declining population. But Japan has managed to average about 2% growth by improving productivity, by squeezing a little bit here and a little bit there. And they do it, in an economy in Japan where most of the women don't work. So I think it's certainly going to be a drag on China, but I don't know that it's going to be a decisive drag in the short to medium term. I think another big problem is going to be water. As the Himalayas snow melts and the glaciers melt, we're already seeing conflicts between China and neighboring countries over the water. I saw recently a report that the Yellow River only runs about half the year anymore. So China has a real water problem, and it also has, as we all know, a huge pollution problem. So I think all of those will affect China proportionately more than the US. Our society will age too, but not as rapidly. Immigration will keep our population more or less the same, maybe a little bit of growth. I think in terms of water, we're going to have problems, but not as bad as China. Atmosphere pollution is not as bad in the US. It's not going to be as bad as in China. So in the longer term, I'm cautiously optimistic, but the problem is that none of us is going to be here in the long term. And in the short to medium term, I think we have a major competition on our hands.
It's that time frame that's fascinating, isn't it? Because again, if we think back to Japan, auto sector, Detroit in the 1980s, Toyota becomes the world's largest manufacturer. China makes the most cars. But Tesla, which wasn't even around a few years ago, has by far the biggest market capitalization. And that speaks to that drive in America, that rebirth that it goes through. Ted, if I could come to you on this point, because I think this is your real area of focus. In that short and medium term, what are the key policy levers that the US government has to pull, and particularly where it relates to trade in that context of competition with China?
I mean, I think, if there's one aspect that Clyde maybe really underplays in his book, it's the importance of innovation for U.S. competitiveness. I mean, the U.S. is dominating a lot of the advanced sectors of the economy, in high tech and internet companies and a whole other series of sectors. And I think part of that is we have a culture that's very fertile for innovation. It's not to say that the Chinese can't compete. The Chinese have been very innovative in many ways themselves, but this is something that the U.S. has done very, very well over the years. And there are lots of reasons for that, a very deep venture capital market. There's certainly been useful government support in different places. Immigration is a huge part of this. Clyde talks about it in his book. This was something that I think the Trump administration was going very much the wrong direction, and attracting smart foreign students in particular to the United States. This is a challenge with China. I mean, the issue of Chinese students is a really complicated one, because if you look at the artificial intelligence research that's going on in the United States, Chinese students who have come and studied and got their PhDs in the United States and stayed here are a big part of that enterprise. It's one of the reasons we have leadership still in artificial intelligence. But Clyde raises very legitimate concerns that you certainly have students and research and others coming here for nefarious purposes, and how to try to weed that out. So I do worry a little bit about a set of recommendations that says, well, we should be more like China in all these different ways. I do think there are places where we can be more like China, but there are also places where the U.S. has real advantages that I think actually show themselves in the competition with Japan, and I think can show themselves in the competition with China if we stop shooting ourselves in the foot quite so much, which we've done a lot recently.
Clyde, just to come back to you on that one, because I think your final chapter is the plan for America, for the US, and what it should be doing. So that speaks directly to what Ted was talking about there.
Well, I think on the one hand, I agree with Ted that the U.S. has been extraordinarily creative and pioneering in new technology. I fear that we're losing that. And I fear that we're losing that because we have lost so much of our industrial base. Typically, when people talk about technological development, they think in a straight line. They think in terms of, okay, you do basic R&D, then you do applied R&D, and then you do mock-ups, and then you produce, and then you're in mass production. It's not that way. Ralph Gomery, the former chief scientist at IBM, was on the phone with me just this morning. And he said, Clyde, R&D is an expense. If you do R&D and get no product and produce nothing, it's a waste. And a problem is that we do a lot of R&D in the US, not as much as we should, but still a lot. But we don't produce anymore. And so the gain from the R&D, so Apple does R&D and then it makes its products in China. The gain from that R&D, a lot of it goes to China rather than to the US. And if you look at, it's very interesting, look at the top economies. So put China aside. China's manufacturing is something like between 30 and 40% of China's GDP. Put them aside. Let's look at advanced rich countries. Germany, 21% of GDP. France, 18%. Italy, 19% of GDP. Taiwan, 28% of GDP. South Korea, 30% of GDP. Japan, 22%. America, 10%. UK, 10%. The Anglos and the Anglo free trade love affair has killed manufacturing in the Anglo countries. And you can't have scientific advance without manufacturing. So hence I put a big emphasis on grabbing back manufacturing. Now, people typically today, you talk manufacturing, people think of sweaty, dirty factories. No. Manufacturing entails software production, and most big factories are robotized and mechanized. If I look at an Intel fabrication facility in Arizona or in Oregon, it doesn't have that many workers, but those workers make $100,000 a year. We only have, Intel is the only major semiconductor company that produces semiconductors in the United States. TSMC in Taiwan, Samsung in Korea. There's others scattered, some in Europe and a couple of more smaller operations in the US. But just go back 15 years, 34% of global semiconductors were made in the United States. Now we're down to about 12%. That's not a recipe for future leadership.
Could I just weigh in quickly, Andrew? We don't want to go too far down this road, but I do think if you look at the semiconductor industry, I mean, the leading companies in the United States, Intel is not the leading company anymore. It's Qualcomm, it's NVIDIA. Apple has started making its own chips for its own applications and not using Intel products so much. Now, a lot of their production, they're fabless. A lot of their production they do in Taiwan and elsewhere, and we can certainly have debates over the security implications of that. I mean, I very much worry about Taiwan being the global center of semiconductor fabrication. But I think it's hard to make an argument that the US has lost the innovative edge when it comes to semiconductors. I think our companies still actually have very much that edge. It's just a lot of the actual work is done in other places. So I disagree a little bit with Clyde on that. Not entirely, but a little bit.
But I need to come back and make a response to I was struck recently, I'm sure we both read the same Wall Street Journal story about Amazon and Apple making their own chips. No, they don't make chips. They design the chip. Qualcomm designs chips, NVIDIA designs chips, but they don't make. They get chips are made in Taiwan or in South Korea.
Clyde, if I could. I'm going to jump in because we're rapidly going to run out of time. I do want to get a quick question in on free trade agreements because there's quite a few questions coming in there. President Trump took America out of the CPTPP as it was then, CPTPP as it is now, and largely seen here in the region as a real strategic blunder. Should the Biden administration take the US back into CPTPP, particularly in the context of that competition for trade and building alliances that we were talking about earlier on? So very quickly to Clyde, Liz, and Ted on that one.
Yeah, so I think diplomatically, it would be a good step to take. In fact, I've even suggested to some that we try to get the EU and the US, Canada, Mexico agreements together with TPP. It's now CPTPP. However, having said that, it's important, I think, to understand that in terms of economics, in terms of trade, selling more, TPP doesn't do much for us. Diplomatically, however, I think it's quite important.
Thank you. Liz, if I could come to you on that, because China's also expressed an interest in joining the CPTPP.
Yeah, this is, in the China community, this is a no-brainer. This is a get back into the CPTPP to be out of the two major trading regimes in the region. RCEP and the CPTPP is just not a winner for the United States. And even though it will be a wash economically, I mean, I think, it's not going to bring much to the American economy. Some jobs lost, some jobs gained. Diplomatically, for the United States to have a stake in the ground, economically, to have an economic pillar in the region, absolutely essential.
And Ted, final word then, the likelihood of that happening with the Biden administration?
Well, I mean, I absolutely agree with Liz and with Clyde. I think it was a huge blunder. The U.S. should get back in the TPP. A bunch of the items would be easy to deal with, but there's one hard one that circles back to Clyde in Japan, and that has to do with rules of origin for automobiles. So, in the TPP rules, very low threshold makes it possible for Japanese and Korean companies where they come in the TPP to source a lot of parts from China, export vehicles tariff-free to the United States. It's a real heartburn for the U.S. companies, particularly with respect to sports utility vehicles and light trucks, which face a 25% tariff. That would be a killer domestic negotiation for the Biden administration to try to deal with. And I don't think they want that fight with the labor unions. But yeah, I mean, I'm with Liz. I think the sooner we can get back in, the better. I think it was a terrible self-inflicted wound.
we are rapidly coming up to the hour, and so I'm going to draw things to a close. I should fascinating start of the discussion around semiconductors. There's a lot on semiconductor industry, techno-nationalism on our website, hinrichfoundation.com. I should also urge all of you who haven't already to get a copy of Clyde's book. It is now fully available, I think, globally. So please do look out for that. It's been a great read for me, and it's been a pleasure to host Clyde, Liz, and Ted today to be able to discuss some of the themes in there. Of course, there's a huge range of topics that we weren't able to cover, but thank you to all of our speakers today, and to you, the audience, for joining us. As I noted earlier on, a recording of this session will be available on our website next week. And with that, thank you, Clyde, thank you, Liz, thank you, Ted, and thank you to the audience for joining us. I wish you all a very good day ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Bye-bye.